Pronunciation. It's such a tricky one, isn't it? People have lots of different views about what good pronunciation is or what they aspire to in terms of their pronunciation. But I guess the thing we need to clarify here is that we're thinking about intelligibility. So, those times when students aren't understood because they're producing the wrong sound. And this is where there's potential for a communication barrier, isn't there?
Yeah, I think so. I think people have lots of different interpretations of what teaching pronunciation means.
I'm Abby.
I'm Charlotte, and you're listening to a My World of ELT podcast. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about our own experiences of teaching pronunciation and working on problem sounds with learners.
So, Charlotte, can you remember working on pronunciation in your own language learning experiences? And how did it make you feel?
Yes, I remember thinking back to when I was learning Spanish and just trying to remember all those differences. For example, when you see a double L together, the pronunciation is more like a y. And if you get that wrong, it affects the intelligibility, it affects people's ability to understand what you're saying. And I think the biggest problem for me was the rolling R in Spanish.
Oh, yeah.
Typically difficult to pronounce for a non-native Spanish speaker. And I couldn't get it. And my Spanish teacher seemed to think it was easy. If they just kept repeating it, then I would be able to mimic it. But I just couldn't. And it made me feel like I wasn't very good. It made me feel like, oh, why can't I do this? I should just be able to produce this sound. And it was actually quite demotivating, because I just couldn't get it right.
That's such a shame. And it makes me think back to language classes at secondary school where, we didn't really get any practical help on how to pronounce these tricky sounds, these unknown sounds. And I remember feeling, particularly at that age, kind of teenage years, a bit embarrassed about trying too hard.
Yes.
I would rather kind of speak the language with my English accent than try to, get some of that tricky pronunciation and risk getting it wrong or making a fool of myself. I don't know. Does that sound familiar?
Oh God, yes. Yeah, learning French at school, exactly the same. Just not getting that input, not getting that help, and just feeling like, oh, I just don't want to do this because it's just too awkward.
Yeah, that's a very common memory. And now that you're, teaching English, we talked about learning languages ourselves at school, but what's your attitude towards teaching pronunciation? And how does this compare to your learners' expectations of studying pronunciation?
Well, when I teach, I understand that students have different first languages. I know that some nationalities will have more difficulty than others with certain sounds. And my attitude towards pronunciation with my learners is that, they don't have to be perfect. They don't have to aim for an English accent. It just has to be intelligible. And I always say to my learners, that having an accent is fine. It's actually a good thing. It's kind of part of your personality and who you are. And that really what we should be focusing on is being understood rather than perfection. And a lot of students, they do seem to crave that perfect English accent. And a lot of them have said to me they'd love to speak English. And for people to not know that they're Italian or Japanese. But I really just try to encourage them towards intelligibility and, actually having an accent is a nice thing, a good thing to have. And they shouldn't feel bad about that or feel like they failed in some way.
I couldn't agree more. I think accents add kind of character and a bit of a
Yes,
personal touch, and we don't want people to sound like robots and all sound the same.
exactly.
And going back to what you were saying about learners wanting to perfect that pronunciation, that's really common, isn't it? And it's quite hard to have to tell them to manage their expectations and that maybe that goal of sounding like a native speaker isn't achievable. So, that can be a little bit, discouraging, I suppose, but it's just about setting realistic goals and making them realize that that's not the most important thing about learning the language.
I agree, actually. That's the hardest thing is your students' disappointment when they realize that actually that might be unachievable. But then our job is to motivate them in other areas and in different ways.
Sure. So, what about teachers of English who are non-native speakers themselves? So, have you ever worked with teachers like that who don't feel particularly confident about their own pronunciation and therefore they don't feel very confident about teaching pronunciation?
Yeah, absolutely. I've worked with a few over the years, and I feel that they don't feel confident about teaching it because, as you said, they don't feel confident about their own pronunciation. Perhaps they don't feel like their pronunciation is good enough. It's not perfect enough. It's not English enough. And therefore they just don't have that confidence about teaching it to their students, which is a real shame.
It is a shame, isn't it?
Yeah, what about you? Have you had those experiences?
Yeah, and I always feel quite sad actually when it comes up because I think that those non-native teachers of English are they're teachers for a reason. They've got a whole range of skills that they can pass on to their students, which are really valuable. And to feel, I mean, I guess we all lack confidence sometimes in our teaching, but to feel like you're not equipped to teach pronunciation just because it's not your first language is is a real shame. And I think
Mm,
as well, sometimes it's a lack of strategies on their part. So they're not really sure how to teach pronunciation. So that maybe they avoid it. And yeah,
yeah.
as you said, I think that can be a real shame.
So, Abby, how do you think pronunciation and listening are linked?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think quite often when we talk about pronunciation, the first thing people think about is speaking. We teach pronunciation to help our students with speaking activities. But actually, there's a lot to be said for teaching pronunciation to help learners with their listening skills. And I think particularly if they're living in an English speaking country, because there are so many features of pronunciation that they might not be using themselves in their own language production, like connected speech, natural speech, stress and intonation. And that's okay because if they can still be understood, those aspects of pronunciation are not overly important to produce. Again, it's coming back to intelligibility, but those features of pronunciation could interfere with their ability to understand someone else. So if they can't decode that sentence stress, um, that can make it difficult for them to understand what they're listening to. So I'm a really big advocate of teaching pronunciation in the context of improving listening skills and decoding and breaking down what you're hearing. But as I say, it's often overlooked. It's often included as something to do when you want to improve your speaking skills. I don't know. How do you feel about that link, making that link clear between speaking and listening?
I agree with what you said. I think it's one of those things very easily overlooked. And it's quite easy to think, right, we've got a speaking lesson today, and I'm going to focus on some of those, how to pronounce those words or how to pronounce that target language. And then I'll move on to something else. And tomorrow we've got a listening lesson, and you don't actually connect them. You don't connect those skills. So I think it's a really good point that you've made. And yeah, I agree with it. And Abby, when you're in the classroom, what kind of tools do you use to teach pronunciation?
Yeah, I think tools is the right word. There's so many different things that we can use as teachers to help us. But, it's a combination of things that I think ultimately is going to bring success. So possibly the IPA chart. I know a lot of people that have that IPA chart in their classrooms on a
Yeah.
wall that they can reference. That's great to a point. I think, I certainly wouldn't encourage teachers to teach the whole of the chart to their class. I don't think it's necessary. I think it can be demotivating, like one more thing to learn.
Yeah, very
Um,
overwhelming, isn't it?
Absolutely, because it is overwhelming. I remember first looking at it as a trainee teacher and feeling
Yeah.
overwhelmed, never mind how our students might feel when they see it. So that can be a good reference in small bite-sized chunks. Um, but also the visual aspect of pronunciation. So I think looking at the shape of the mouth and maybe using mirrors or phones for selfies to kind of see what's happening here. How is this sound made? What's the shape of the mouth? Where's my chin? Is it, dropped or is it closed? So I think you know, everyone's got a smartphone these days. Getting them to use their cameras can be a really good option. Look at what the
Yeah.
teacher's doing, look at what I'm doing. Also, things like Cuisenaire rods to show syllable stress, so different colours that represent the stress within a word or within a sentence, even. But yeah, I think you can get really creative with the physicality of pronunciation and the things that you can take into class to help students visualize these sounds rather than just relying on their auditory skills. So
Yeah.
my advice, I think, would be, you know, a little bit of everything. So build
Yeah.
that toolkit and rely on lots of different things instead of one thing only.
And what do you think about sometimes perhaps using what you were saying about visual cues, perhaps a drawing on the board of a mouth, just to show like maybe where that sound is made within the mouth? And is it, you know, by the teeth? Is it further back?
Yeah,
You know, do you
sure.
think that could be helpful?
It can definitely help. There are so many things going on inside the mouth. We don't even think about it half of the time. And I agree that seeing a visual, seeing a diagram like that can help students to really understand what's happening when we produce
Mm.
these sounds, because it's not just mind power. We don't just produce these
Yeah.
sounds by really wanting to. There's something going on there, whether it's the position of the tongue or the lips or the teeth. So any kind of diagrams like that that help them to look inside the mouth and think about what's happening should, in theory, help them with, you know, that positioning.
Maybe one day I will get that rolling R.
That's what you were lacking, a picture on the
Yeah,
board of what's going on inside
that's
the
what I
mouth.
needed. So people often focus on modelling and drilling to help with pronunciation, but what can we do if students just can't get it? So we've talked about this a bit already. Is there anything else that
Yeah.
you could mention?
Yeah, well, we haven't talked about like the modeling and drilling, which is the most common. You know, I'll say it, you repeat it, I'll say it. But you're quite right that I think when that doesn't work, it's all about the physicality. So, how are we making that sound? And I remember myself when I was still, you know, learning about how to teach pronunciation, and I knew a lot less than I do now. I remember just, I'll say it and they'll repeat it and they'll just magically get it right. And when it
Yeah.
didn't happen, that was incredibly awkward for everybody. How many times do you repeat this before you give up on it and move on? But then I started to learn more as a developing teacher about what's actually going on when we produce these sounds and how can I help my students to understand what's going on when we produce these sounds. And I think that really opened a door that it's not just willpower, it's something moving and ending up in a slightly different position, whether that's the tongue moving backwards, the teeth being more closed, the lip being, you know, under the top teeth. All of those things are things that are tangible, that you can
Yeah.
show, you can demonstrate, you can explain, you can draw on the board. So I think modeling and drilling is great if it's just a case of maybe seeing the written word and not knowing how it's said. But
Yeah.
if a learner can't produce the sounds within that word, you've got to do a lot more than just repeat it. So that's where that toolkit comes into play.
Yeah, and I find it's very useful as well to have an awareness of your students' L1 and sounds that perhaps they won't know how to produce because they don't have them in their first language. So this won't be the case for all classes because maybe you're with a class and their L1 is the same as your L1. But if you've got a mixed nationality class, then it may be that you need to think about what their L1 is and sounds that they may never have made before, which we have in our English alphabet.
Like that rolling R for
Uh,
Spanish learners. It keeps coming back, doesn't
yeah,
it? Someone
coming
does
back to
that
haunt
rolling R.
me.
Yeah, and actually, you know, Learner English is a great book for that.
Yeah,
To really, if you don't know, a lot of it you learn on the job, don't you? You just become familiar with what sounds certain nationalities have problems with. But if you're not familiar with that language, then going away and doing a bit of research and anticipating what they might struggle with is a really good piece of advice to prepare you and walk in there already with some ideas up your sleeve of how to tackle it.
absolutely. And I would encourage every new teacher to do that. And Abby, what would you say to someone who says that teaching pronunciation is all about choosing an accent?
Yeah, so we mentioned that a lot of our learners have these unrealistic goals. And I think this comes from, media, that maybe they're watching films, maybe they've, got favorite actors or actresses and they want to sound like that person. They like their accent. I don't know about you, but I've had a lot of students coming and saying they either like somebody's accent or they don't like somebody's accent. So it's all about sounding like the people that they want to sound like. But I think it's so incredibly hard to engineer an accent. And really, as we said, there's so much character that comes from your accent, and it's a good thing. Embrace that.
Yeah.
It's, why try and get rid of it and stamp it out? So I would say that for me, teaching and pronunciation is not about accent at all. It's about being understood. That's
Yeah.
that's the bottom line. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, absolutely. And it reminds me of students in the past who have said to me, "Oh, I went out last night, I went for dinner, or I tried to order something, or I was in a shop and I tried to buy something. And when I was talking, the person that I was talking to said, 'Oh, you're French, aren't you?' And it was so disappointing because they knew where I was from, and I thought I was speaking really good English. And yeah, it comes back to the argument of, well, you were speaking good English
Yeah.
because you had a great conversation with someone. You had the confidence to order that food or buy that item in a shop. And again, just encouraging learners to not make that link between good English and a perfect English accent, but actually to make that link between good English and good intelligibility.
That's right. I mean, communication is everything, isn't it? At the
Yeah.
end of the day, if you can communicate effectively, it's certainly not a sign of failure if somebody can identify your accent. So, Charlotte, what tips would you give to someone who is a non-native speaker of English, a teacher of English, but they avoid focusing on pronunciation because they're not confident?
Well, I would say to them, first of all, build on that confidence and try and be confident because you are a good model for your students. You don't have to be an expert in English or English pronunciation to be a good model for them. And as a person who's already learned English, you kind of know all of the struggles that your students are going through. You know the difficulties they're going to have. And so you're the perfect person to help them through those struggles and help them get to a better place with their pronunciation.
I think that can be such a key advantage for non-native speakers,
Yeah,
can't it? To say, I've been there, I know what it's like, and look,
definitely.
I've done it, so you can do it too.
Yeah. And Abby, what about native speaker teachers who don't have that level of awareness of how sounds are produced, and so they find it tricky to teach?
Yeah, I suppose this is the other end of the spectrum, and we find this on teacher training courses a lot, where there might be some people who are speaking English as a second language and they doubt their ability and their confidence in pronunciation. And then you get native speakers who obviously have great pronunciation, but they've never really thought about what they're doing to produce those sounds. So they find it incredibly difficult to teach other people how to make those sounds. So awareness, I think, is everything, really breaking down, even at word level. Say this word, what's happening? What does it look like? How would you describe to a student what's happening inside the mouth, to the lips, to the teeth, the tongue, the movement of the tongue? Where is the contact? So I think really just breaking the language down, looking at yourself in a mirror and asking yourself the question, what's happening to produce this sound? So where is it produced? How is it produced? How would I explain that to someone else? That's got to be the first step, I think, before you can teach anybody, is understanding for yourself.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. And I would also say along with that, from my experience, that's where the IPA is so helpful. When you're teacher training, just to get your trainees to look at that and just become aware actually of those 44 sounds that we're making.
Yeah.
Because the chances are, if you're a native speaker, you've just never really thought about it before.
Or the fact that there are 44 of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. If you would like some tips on how to help students improve their pronunciation with some practical techniques, click on the link for our free downloadable worksheet.
And did you know that we also have a language module on this topic? Go to our website to check out our bite-sized language modules, focusing on practical classroom phrases and teaching tips on a range of topics.
Thanks for listening to this My World of ELT podcast, and see you next time.
Bye.